Hello, and welcome to Mr. Crime and Sleep. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Whether you're a returning listener or joining us for the very first time, you are welcome here. This is a place where stories are told slowly, gently in the dark, designed to carry you softly toward rest. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you to do a couple of things. First, if you're comfortable, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. I always love reading those. And second, if you enjoy what you hear tonight, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It truly makes a difference for a small channel like this one. Now, a moment of sincerity before we start. Every story you hear tonight involves real people, real lives that were lived and lost under terrible circumstances. We tell these stories to remember the victims, to honor their memory, and to keep their names alive. We tell them with respect and with the hope that awareness might someday prevent another family from enduring the same pain. Tonight's episode is called Cases That Keep Detectives Awake at Night. We'll be exploring 5 of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. 5 mysteries that have resisted decades of investigation, that have consumed the careers of countless detectives, and that continue to generate debate and speculation to this day. From the mountains of Colorado to the streets of San Francisco, from wartime Los Angeles to the frozen forests of New Hampshire, and finally to the skies above the Pacific Northwest. These are stories without endings, stories that remain after all these years, stubbornly and maddeningly open. For the best experience, lower the volume just a touch, dim the lights, get comfortable, let the words drift over you like clouds crossing a night sky. And let's begin. Story 1. JonBenét Ramsey. Our first story takes us to Boulder, Colorado, a city unlike any other in the American West. If you've never been to Boulder, imagine a place where the Great Plains collide with the Rocky Mountains in a sudden, dramatic wall of red sandstone called the Flatirons. These enormous slabs of rock, tilted at sharp angles by geological forces millions of years old, catch the morning sun and glow like embers against the deep blue Colorado sky. They are visible from almost everywhere in the city, a constant looming reminder that you are on the edge of something wild and vast and ancient. Boulder itself is a university town, home to the University of Colorado, and it carries all the characteristics you might associate with such a place. Bookstores and coffee shops, bicycle lanes and hiking trails, a downtown pedestrian mall lined with street musicians and locally owned boutiques. The population is well educated, affluent, health conscious. People jog along Boulder Creek in the early morning. They hike to the summit of Green Mountain before breakfast. They shop at organic markets and attend lectures on quantum physics and Buddhist meditation. It is, in many ways, an American ideal, a place where natural beauty and intellectual ambition exist in comfortable harmony. But Boulder is also a small city, and small cities, for all their charm, can be insular. The police department in 1996 was modest in size, accustomed to dealing with bicycle thefts and noise complaints from college parties, not violent crime. The murder rate was effectively zero. Serious investigations were rare. This would matter enormously in the days and weeks to come. On the 15th of June, 1990, JonBenét Ramsey married Patricia Ann Paw, Patsy, as everyone called her. John was a successful businessman, the president of Access Graphics, a computer services company that was a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. The company was thriving, having recently surpassed $1 billion in annual revenue, and John Ramsey was reaping the rewards. He was wealthy, respected, and established in the Boulder community. Patsy was a former beauty queen, Miss West Virginia, 1977, who had brought her love of pageantry and performance into motherhood. She was vivacious, social, and deeply involved in her children's lives. Together, they had 2 children, Burke, born in 1987, and JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, born on August the 6th, 1990. JonBenét, even the name carries a kind of music to it, a blend of her father's name and her mother's middle name, elegant and unusual, the kind of name that belongs in a storybook. And indeed, the life that John and Patsy Ramsey built for their youngest daughter had a storybook quality to it. They lived at 749 15th Street, a large Tudor-style home in one of Boulder's most desirable neighborhoods. The house had 15 rooms spread across 3 levels, with a labyrinthine floor plan that included hidden nooks, narrow staircases, and a basement that sprawled beneath the main structure like a cave beneath a castle. JonBenét was, by all accounts, a bright and charming child, precocious, playful, fond of singing and dancing. But she became known to the wider world for something else entirely: her participation in children's beauty pageants. Patsy, drawing on her own pageant experience, had entered JonBenét in competitions from a very young age, and the little girl had taken to it with enthusiasm. She won titles: Little Miss Colorado, America's Royale Miss, National Tiny Miss Beauty, and the photographs from these events show a child dressed and made up to look far older than her years, with elaborate hairstyles, heavy makeup, and costumes that sparkled under stage lights. These images would later become some of the most scrutinized photographs in American crime history. They would be broadcast on every news channel, printed in every tabloid, analyzed by every armchair detective. They would fuel debates about the sexualization of children, about the pressures of performance, about the line between nurturing a child's talents and exploiting them. But on Christmas Day, 1996, all of that was still in the future. On Christmas Day, JonBenét Ramsey was simply a 6-year-old girl, excited about her presents, enjoying the holiday with her family. The Ramseys spent Christmas evening at a party hosted by their friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, who lived nearby. It was a casual affair. Families gathered together, children playing while adults shared wine and conversation. JonBenét had been a little under the weather, slightly congested, but nothing serious. The family returned home around 9:30 in the evening. According to John and Patsy's accounts, the routine that followed was ordinary. John carried the sleeping JonBenét upstairs to her bedroom on the 2nd floor. Burke, their 9-year-old son, played with a toy he had received for Christmas before going to bed. Patsy helped JonBenét into bed and said goodnight. John read to Burke for a while before the boy fell asleep. The house settled into the quiet of Christmas night. Outside, Boulder lay still beneath a cold December sky. The streets empty, the houses dark except for the soft glow of Christmas lights strung along roof lines and wrapped around porch railings Snow dusted the flatirons in the distance. It was, by every measure, a peaceful night. And then it was morning. At approximately 5:52 a.m. on December the 26th, 1996, Patsy Ramsey descended the spiral staircase from the third floor of the house, where the master bedroom was located. She was heading downstairs to make coffee to prepare for a flight to Michigan, where the family planned to spend the rest of the holiday with relatives. On one of the steps of the staircase, she found 3 sheets of paper, handwritten. She picked them up and began to read. The letter was addressed to Mr. Ramsey. It informed him that his daughter had been kidnapped by a small foreign faction and demanded $118,000 in ransom for her safe return. The letter was long, 2.5 pages, and its tone veered between menacing and almost theatrical. It warned against contacting the police. It warned against contacting the FBI. It warned that JonBenét would be beheaded if the family did not comply. And it ended with the initials SBTC, which have never been satisfactorily explained. The ransom amount itself was peculiar. $118,000 is not a round number. It is not the kind of sum that a professional kidnapper would demand from a man whose company had just cleared $1 billion in revenue. A real kidnapper targeting a wealthy family might ask for $1 million, $5 million, $10 million, but $118,000. It was, however, almost exactly the amount of John Ramsey's most recent bonus from Access Graphics, a detail that only someone with intimate knowledge of the family's finances would know. The note itself was extraordinary in other ways. At 2.5 pages, it was one of the longest ransom notes in criminal history. Professional kidnappers write short, direct notes. Give us the money. Follow these instructions. Do not contact the police. This note read more like a movie script, borrowing phrases from films like Dirty Harry, Speed, and Ransom. It warned the family that they were not the only fat cat around, and advised John to use that good southern common sense of yours. It was personal, theatrical, and strangely specific. The work, many analysts believed, of someone who knew the family intimately, not a stranger who had broken in from outside. Handwriting analysis became one of the most contentious elements of the investigation. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation compared the note to handwriting samples from dozens of individuals connected to the case. John Ramsey was effectively eliminated as the author, but Patsy Ramsey was not. Analysts could neither conclusively identify her as the writer nor rule her out. One expert said there were indications that Patsy had written the note. Another said the similarities were insufficient for a definitive conclusion. The ambiguity was maddening, a mirror reflecting whatever the viewer wanted to see. The notepad on which the ransom letter was written came from inside the Ramsey home. So did the pen, and a practice note, an abandoned early draft, was found on the same pad. This meant that whoever wrote the note had done so while inside the house, had started once, scrapped it, and started again. The implications were unsettling regardless of which theory you favored. If an intruder had done this, he had spent considerable time inside the home, calmly composing a ransom note while a family slept upstairs. If a family member had done it, the staging was elaborate and calculated. Patsy called 911 at 5:52 a.m. Her voice on the recording was frantic, high-pitched, nearly hysterical. "We have a kidnapping," she told the dispatcher. There's a note left, and our daughter is gone. She then called several friends, including the Whites and the Fernies, another family close to the Ramseys, and asked them to come to the house immediately. This decision to invite people into what should have been a sealed crime scene would have consequences that rippled through the investigation for decades. When Boulder police arrived, they found a house filling with people. Friends were walking through rooms, sitting on furniture, using bathrooms. The crime scene, such as it was being contaminated with every passing minute. Officer Rick French was the first to arrive, and he conducted a cursory search of the house, checking bedrooms and closets. He went to the basement, but did not open a particular door, a door that was secured with a wooden latch, because, he later said, he was looking for points of entry and exit, not searching for a body. The assumption at that point was that this was a kidnapping, and the victim was no longer in the house. That door led to the wine cellar, and behind it, in the cold and the dark, lay JonBenét Ramsey. Hours passed. The FBI was called. Victim advocates arrived. The house continued to fill with people, their footprints overlapping on the floors, their fingerprints layering onto surfaces, their presence steadily erasing whatever forensic evidence might have been preserved. It was, by any professional standard, a catastrophic failure of crime scene management. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, more than 7 hours after the 911 call, Detective Linda Arndt, who was alone at the house with the family and friends, while other officers pursued leads elsewhere, asked John Ramsey to search the house. She later testified that she wanted him to stay busy, to have something to do. She suggested he start in the basement. John Ramsey went downstairs. He walked through the basement, past the boiler room, past the storage areas, to the door with the wooden latch. The same door that Officer French had passed by that morning. He opened it. Inside the wine cellar, in the darkness, he found his daughter. JonBenét was lying on the floor, wrapped in a white blanket. Her wrists were bound above her head with a cord. Her mouth was covered with duct tape. Around her neck was a garrote, a crude but effective strangulation device made from a length of cord and a broken paintbrush handle. John Ramsey tore the tape from her mouth. He picked her up and carried her upstairs, through the basement, up the stairs, and into the living room, where he placed her on the floor near the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree, still decorated, still lit with colored lights, still surrounded by torn wrapping paper and discarded ribbons from the morning's gift opening just 2 days before. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable. A dead child lying beneath a Christmas tree, the symbols of celebration and innocence surrounding a scene of absolute horror. She was cold. She was stiff. She had been dead for hours, likely since the early morning hours of December the 26th, perhaps even before Patsy had found the ransom note. While the family had been waiting for a kidnapper's phone call, while the police had been pursuing a kidnapping theory, while friends had been arriving and coffee had been brewing and hours had been ticking past, JonBenét had been lying in that dark basement room, already gone, already beyond rescue. Detective Arndt, upon seeing the body, knew immediately that the crime scene had been irrevocably compromised. The body had been moved. The duct tape had been removed. Whatever evidence the wine cellar might have yielded, fingerprints, fiber evidence, DNA, had been disturbed by the father's understandable but forensically devastating actions. The autopsy, performed the following day by Boulder County Coroner John Meyer, revealed the full horror of what had been done to JonBenét. The cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniotrauma. In simpler terms, she had been strangled with a garrote and had also suffered a massive skull fracture, a crack that extended nearly 8.5 inches along the right side of her skull. The fracture was so severe that it had caused a large area of hemorrhaging in the brain. The question of which injury came first, the blow to the head or the strangulation, would become a point of fierce debate among forensic experts. Some believed the head injury came first, rendering JonBenét unconscious, and that the strangulation followed. Others argued the reverse. The sequence mattered because it spoke to the nature of the crime, whether it was a rage killing that escalated or a deliberate, premeditated murder. There was also evidence of prior vaginal injury, a detail that added an even more disturbing dimension to the case and fueled speculation about possible ongoing abuse. This finding, too, would be debated endlessly, with experts disagreeing about what the evidence actually showed. The investigation that followed was, by almost universal agreement, deeply flawed from its very first hours. The Boulder Police Department, inexperienced with homicide investigations, made critical errors that would haunt the case for decades. In a city that averaged fewer than one murder per year, the department simply did not have the institutional knowledge or the forensic infrastructure to handle a case of this magnitude. The crime scene was not properly secured. For 7 hours, friends, family, and victim advocates wandered freely through the house, sitting on couches, using bathrooms, making coffee in the kitchen. Every surface they touched, every room they entered, every doorknob they turned, added another layer of contamination to a crime scene that should have been sealed and processed with meticulous care. Years later, defense attorneys would point to this contamination as a reason why forensic evidence from the house could not be trusted. Evidence was not properly collected. The ransom note, which should have been a goldmine of forensic information, fingerprints, DNA from saliva used to seal envelopes, handwriting analysis, paper composition, ink analysis, was handled by multiple people before it was preserved. Patsy had picked it up. Police officers had handled it. It was placed on the floor, on a table, passed from hand to hand. By the time it reached the forensic lab, its evidentiary value had been significantly compromised. The decision to allow John Ramsey to search the house 7 hours into what was supposedly a kidnapping case was perhaps the most consequential error. In a kidnapping, the house is a crime scene. The victim may still be present. Every room should be searched by trained professionals systematically with gloves and evidence bags and cameras. Instead, a detective asked the father to do it, and the father, driven by instinct, by love, by the primal need to find his child, went straight to the room where she lay and lifted her into his arms, destroying whatever forensic evidence the wine cellar might have contained. Detectives focused early and intensely on the Ramsey family as suspects, an understandable instinct, given that statistics show most child murders are committed by family members or someone known to the child. But in doing so, they may have neglected to adequately pursue other leads. Neighbors were not immediately canvassed. Security camera footage from nearby businesses was not promptly collected. A sex offender registry check for the area was not conducted in the first critical days. The tunnel vision that characterized the early investigation would later be cited by critics as the primary reason the case was never solved. The relationship between the police and the Ramsey family deteriorated rapidly. The Ramseys hired attorneys. They submitted to a CNN interview before sitting down for formal police questioning, a decision that infuriated investigators and that the public interpreted as suspicious. When formal interviews finally occurred, months after the murder, the Ramseys' answers were careful, lawyered, and unsatisfying to detectives who wanted raw, unfiltered responses. The Boulder District Attorney's Office and the police department were frequently at odds, each accusing the other of mishandling the case. A grand jury was convened in 1998 and heard evidence for over a year. In 1999, the grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey, not on murder charges, but on counts of child abuse resulting in death and being accessories to a crime. But District Attorney Alex Hunter refused to sign the indictments, determining that the evidence was insufficient to secure a conviction. This decision was not made public until 2013, when it was revealed through a court order. The grand jury's vote and Hunter's refusal to prosecute created a profound rupture in public perception. For those who believed the Ramseys were guilty, Hunter's decision was a miscarriage of justice. For those who believed in their innocence, the grand jury's vote was the product of an overzealous prosecution, feeding biased evidence to jurors. Meanwhile, the theories multiplied like weeds in an untended garden. Was it an intruder? The Ramseys had always maintained that an unknown person had entered their home, committed the crime, and left without being detected. There was some evidence to support this: an open window in the basement, a scuff mark on the wall beneath it, and, most significantly, unidentified male DNA found mixed with JonBenét's blood in her underwear and on her clothing. Was it a family member? The police believed so, pointing to the ransom note, which handwriting analysts said bore similarities to Patsy's writing, and to what they perceived as suspicious behavior by the parents in the hours and days after the murder. Was it Burke, the 9-year-old brother? This theory, advanced most notably by a 2016 CBS documentary called The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, suggested that Burke had struck JonBenét with a heavy Maglite flashlight during a dispute over a bedtime snack of pineapple. Fresh pineapple was found in JonBenét's digestive system, and a bowl of pineapple with Burke's fingerprints was found on the kitchen table, and that the parents had then staged the scene to protect their surviving child. The documentary featured a panel of experts who reconstructed the crime and concluded that the evidence pointed to Burke. The theory was explosive and controversial. Burke Ramsey, by then a young man in his late 20s, filed a massive lawsuit against CBS seeking $750 million in damages. The suit was eventually settled for an undisclosed amount. Burke himself gave a rare interview to Dr. Phil McGraw in 2016, in which he denied any involvement and appeared, to many viewers, awkward and uncomfortable, though supporters argued that his demeanor was simply that of a deeply private person thrust into an unwanted spotlight. The Ramseys' attorney called the CBS theory a disgrace, and pointed out that no prosecutor, no grand jury, and no investigative body had ever formally accused Burke of the crime. The Boulder Police Department declined to comment on the documentary's conclusions. And then there was the DNA. The DNA evidence has been both the strongest argument for the intruder theory and the most contentious element of the entire case. In 2008, using new touch DNA technology, investigators found genetic material on JonBenét's clothing that matched the unidentified male profile found in her underwear. Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey formally exonerated the Ramsey family, stating that the DNA evidence pointed to an unknown intruder, but not everyone agreed with Lacey's conclusion. Some experts argued that touch DNA is easily transferred and could have come from a factory worker who handled the clothing during manufacturing. The exoneration, rather than closing the case, simply opened another chapter in the never-ending debate. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer on June the 24th, 2006. She was 49 years old. She went to her grave without ever knowing who killed her daughter, and, if the police theory was correct, without ever being held accountable. If the intruder theory was correct, she died with the additional burden of having spent the last decade of her life under public suspicion for a crime she did not commit. John Ramsey has continued to advocate for the case, pushing for advanced DNA testing and meeting regularly with Boulder police. At CrimeCon in Denver in September of 2025, he spoke publicly about his renewed optimism. He urged Boulder authorities to use investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that had cracked the Golden State Killer case, to identify the unknown male whose DNA was found on his daughter's body. As of this telling, the case remains open. Nearly 3 decades have passed. The house on 15th Street still stands. The wine cellar is still there, behind that door, with the wooden latch. And somewhere, perhaps, the person responsible for what happened on that Christmas night is still alive, still free, still carrying the weight of what they did to a 6-year-old girl in a house full of Christmas presents and sleeping children. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old. She liked to sing and dance. She liked to perform. She was, beneath the costumes and the makeup and the pageant titles, simply a little girl who deserved to grow up. She deserved first days of school and slumber parties and awkward teenage years and college applications and all the ordinary, extraordinary milestones of a life fully lived. Instead, she became the most famous murder victim of the 1990s. Her face frozen forever at 6. Her story a wound that will not close. Rest with that thought for a moment. Breathe slowly. Feel the quiet around you. And when you're ready, we'll move on to our next story. One that involves cryptic codes, taunting letters, and a killer who dared the police to catch him. Our second story takes us north to the fog-shrouded streets of San Francisco in the late 1960s, where a serial killer terrorized a city and turned murder into a puzzle. But first, let the silence settle. Let your body grow heavy. There is no rush. The night is long. Story 2. The man who signed his letters with a crosshair. The Zodiac Killer. Welcome back, gentle listener. If you drifted away during our first story, that's perfectly fine. You're exactly where you need to be. Let the words find you again. Wherever you are in that soft space between waking and sleep, our second story takes us to Northern California in the late 1960s, a time and place unlike any other in American history. The summer of love had come and gone, leaving behind a San Francisco that was equal parts idealism and disillusionment. The counterculture was in full bloom. Haight-Ashbury was still a destination for young dreamers seeking peace, music, and freedom. The Golden Gate Bridge hung in the fog like a monument to possibility, and beneath it all, in the quiet suburbs and the dark lovers' lanes that dotted the hills around the Bay Area, something terrible was stirring. The landscape of this story is essential to understanding it. Northern California in the late 60s was a patchwork of worlds that existed side by side but rarely touch. San Francisco was the city, cosmopolitan, liberal, electric, with cultural revolution. But just across the bridges and beyond the hills lay a different California entirely. Small towns, quiet streets, open farmland, and the kind of darkness that settles over rural America when the sun goes down and the lights go out. It was in these quieter places, on the edges of the great city's light, that the Zodiac chose to hunt. The first confirmed attack occurred on the evening of December the 20th, 1968, on a stretch of road called Lake Herman Road near the small city of Benicia, about 30 miles northeast of San Francisco. The road ran through open, rolling hills, cattle country, and was known locally as a popular spot for young couples to park and spend time together away from the eyes of parents and neighbors. David Arthur Faraday was 17 years old. He was a senior at Hogan High School in Vallejo, a good student, an Eagle Scout, a wrestler on the school team, the kind of young man that communities hold up as an example of what a teenager should be. His friends described him as quiet, dependable, the sort of person you could count on. Betty Lou Jensen was 16, a junior at the same school, pretty and popular, with a shy smile and plans that stretched far beyond the Vallejo city limits. They were on their first date that evening, a Friday night, a week before Christmas, and David had borrowed his mother's brown Rambler sedan for the occasion. They had attended a Christmas concert at the school earlier that evening, then driven out to Lake Herman Road, where the darkness and the quiet offered the privacy that teenagers crave. The road was lonely at that hour. Cattle grazed in the surrounding fields, invisible in the darkness. The only light came from the Rambler's headlights and the distant glow of the Benicia Industrial Park to the south. It was cold, mid-December cold, the kind that fogs the windows of a parked car and turns breath to vapor. Sometime around 11 o'clock that night, another car pulled up alongside them on the dark road. What happened next was swift and brutal. Betty Lou was shot 5 times in the back as she tried to run. David was shot once in the head at close range. The killer used a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol fired from just a few feet away. A passing motorist discovered the scene shortly after and flagged down a patrol car. David was still barely alive when the officers arrived, lying face up beside the car. He was rushed to the hospital, but died en route. Betty Lou was already gone, her body lying in the grass about 30 feet from the car, as if she had known, in those last terrible seconds, that escape was impossible, but had tried anyway. The Solano County Sheriff's Department investigated, but found little to work with. There were no witnesses. There was no apparent motive. David and Betty Lou had no enemies, no entanglements, no reason whatsoever for anyone to want them dead. The case went cold. 6.5 months later, on the 4th of July, 1969, the killer struck again. This time, the location was Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, just 4 miles from the Lake Herman Road attack. The victims were Darlene Farron, 22, and Michael Mageau, 19. They were sitting in Darlene's car in the parking lot of the park, a place that, like Lake Herman Road, was known as a gathering spot for young people. At approximately midnight, a car pulled into the parking lot and parked beside them. It sat there for a few minutes, then drove away. About 10 minutes later, it returned. This time, the driver emerged and approached Darlene's car, carrying a powerful flashlight. Without a word, the figure raised a 9mm pistol and opened fire through the passenger window, striking both Darlene and Michael multiple times. Michael, despite being hit in the neck, jaw, and chest, survived by playing dead. He lay motionless in the car, blood pooling around him, listening to the sound of the attacker's footsteps receding on the gravel. After a few moments of silence, the attacker returned. Perhaps he had heard a sound. Perhaps he wanted to be certain. He fired 2 more rounds into the car, hitting Michael again, before finally walking away and driving off into the night. Michael would survive his injuries, though the physical and psychological scars would last a lifetime. He later described the shooter as a heavy-set man, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, with a round face and curly hair. The description would be refined over the years, but the basic outline remained consistent. Darlene, hit 9 times, was not as fortunate. She was pronounced dead on arrival at Kaiser Foundation Hospital. She was 22 years old. She was a young mother with a toddler daughter named Dina waiting for her at home. A little girl who would grow up without her mother, who would learn about her mother's death not from family stories, told around a kitchen table, but from newspaper articles and television documentaries and the endless grinding machinery of true crime fascination. But what happened next set this case apart from any ordinary murder. Approximately 40 minutes after the shooting at 12:40 a.m., a man called the Vallejo Police Department from a payphone at a gas station about half a mile from the Vallejo Sheriff's Department. The caller spoke in a monotone voice, calm, unhurried. He said, "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of Columbus Parkway in a public park. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." And then he hung up. It was the first time the killer had claimed credit for his work. It would not be the last. On August the 1st, 1969, 3 nearly identical letters arrived at 3 different Bay Area newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter contained 1/3 of a 408-symbol cryptogram, a coded message that the writer claimed would reveal his identity. Each letter also contained details of the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs attacks that only the killer could have known. The letters demanded that all 3 newspapers publish their respective portions of the cryptogram on their front pages. If they refused, the writer warned, he would go on a kill rampage through the city, picking off people as they left their homes on a Friday night. The newspapers published the codes. A week later, on August the 7th, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner. It began with the words that would define the case. Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. It was the first time the killer used the name that would become one of the most infamous aliases in criminal history. The letter was accompanied by a symbol, a circle with a crosshair superimposed on it, like the reticle of a rifle scope. This symbol would become the Zodiac's signature, his brand, the icon of an unsolved nightmare that would haunt the Bay Area for years to come. The 408-symbol cryptogram was cracked within a week by a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife, Betty, working from their home in Salinas. The decoded message was chilling, but ultimately unhelpful. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all the people I have killed will become my slaves. The message did not contain the killer's name. The Zodiac had lied. The attacks continued. On September the 27th, 1969, the Zodiac struck at Lake Berryessa, a reservoir in the rural hills of Napa County. This is wine country, the same rolling vine-covered hills that produce some of the world's finest Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. The lake itself is a long, narrow body of water surrounded by golden grass and scattered oak trees, a popular spot for fishing, swimming, and picnicking during the warm months. In September, the summer crowds have thinned, and the lake takes on a quieter, more contemplative character. The kind of place where you might spread a blanket on the shore and watch the afternoon light change on the water. The victims were Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, both students at Pacific Union College, a small Seventh-day Adventist school in Angwin, about 20 miles west of the lake. They had driven to the lake for a quiet afternoon together, young love in the California sun, the sort of outing that should produce nothing more dramatic than a mild sunburn and a pleasant memory. They were picnicking on the lakeshore on a warm autumn afternoon when a man approached them wearing one of the most disturbing costumes in criminal history, a black executioner-style hood with a bib that hung down over his chest, on which was sewn the crossed circle Zodiac symbol in white. The figure carried a semi-automatic pistol and a length of pre-cut clothesline rope. Speaking in a calm, measured voice, he told Brian and Cecilia that he was an escaped convict who needed their car and money to get to Mexico. He ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's hands and feet, then tied Cecilia himself. And then, without warning, he produced a knife and began stabbing them. Brian, 6 times in the back. Cecilia 10 times in the back and abdomen. Both victims were left for dead. The killer walked to Brian's car and, with deliberate care, drew the Zodiac crosshair symbol on the door in black marker. Beneath it, he wrote the dates and locations of his previous attacks and the words Vallejo/December 20th, 68/July 4th, 69, /September 27th, 69, 6:30, /by knife. Brian Hartnell survived his injuries. Cecilia Shepard, after fighting for her life for 2 days, died in the hospital on September the 29th. She was 22 years old. 2 weeks later, on October the 11th, 1969, the Zodiac committed his final confirmed murder, and in doing so, made the boldest and most reckless move of his career. He killed, not in a remote lover's lane or an isolated lakeshore, but in the heart of San Francisco itself. Paul Lee Stein was a 29-year-old graduate student at San Francisco State University, studying English literature while driving a taxi for the Yellow Cab Company to help pay for his education. He was married, quiet, well liked by those who knew him. On the evening of October the 11th, he picked up a fare in downtown San Francisco. A man in a dark jacket who asked to be taken to the intersection of Washington and Maple Streets in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. Presidio Heights was, and remains, one of the most affluent residential areas in San Francisco. The homes are large, the streets are tree-lined, and the neighborhood sits on a hill overlooking the Presidio, the former military base that now serves as a national park. It is the last place you would expect a murder to occur, but that, perhaps, was the point. The Zodiac was demonstrating that he could kill anywhere, at any time, in any neighborhood. No one was safe. Not the teenagers on lovers' lanes. Not the college students at lakeside picnics. Not the taxi drivers in Pacific Heights. When the cab stopped, the passenger shot Paul Stein once in the right side of the head with a 9mm pistol, killing him instantly. He then tore a large piece of Stein's shirt, took his wallet and car keys, and wiped down surfaces in the cab before walking away into the night. This time, there were witnesses. 3 teenagers across the street saw a man leaning into the cab and called the police. Officers from the San Francisco Police Department converged on the area within minutes. And here, in one of the most agonizing near misses in law enforcement history, a patrol car actually stopped a man walking away from the scene and asked him if he had seen anything suspicious. The man, white, stocky, crew cut, said he had seen someone running in the opposite direction. The officers thanked him and drove on. It is widely believed that the man they stopped was the Zodiac killer himself. A police dispatcher had erroneously broadcast that the suspect was a black male, and the officers, looking for someone who did not match the description of the white man before them, let him go. The error was not corrected for several minutes, by which time the man had vanished into the dark streets of Presidio Heights. The letters continued long after the murders stopped, and it was the letters, perhaps more than the murders themselves, that transformed the Zodiac from a local threat into a national obsession. Between 1969 and 1974, the Zodiac sent a total of at least 18 letters and cards to newspapers, police, and even to celebrity attorney Melvin Belli, claiming responsibility for as many as 37 murders, though investigators have only confirmed 5 killings and 2 surviving victims. The letters were written in a distinctive, slightly childish handwriting that never varied. They were peppered with misspellings that some analysts believed were deliberate, an attempt to disguise the writer's true level of education. They were by turns boastful, threatening, mocking, and strangely playful, as if the Zodiac regarded the entire enterprise as a game between himself and the authorities. In one letter, he threatened to shoot the tires of a school bus and pick off the children as they came bouncing out. The threat sent a wave of panic through the Bay Area. School districts hired armed guards for their buses. Parents drove their children to school. The Zodiac appeared to relish the fear he had created. In another, sent to the San Francisco Chronicle on November the 8th, 1969, he included a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt, proof that he was, in fact, the killer and not a copycat seeking attention. The letter also included a detailed description of how he had nearly been caught that night, walking calmly past the police officers who had stopped him in Presidio Heights, and how he had escaped into the darkness of a nearby park. The tone was almost conversational, as if he were telling an amusing anecdote at a dinner party. Some letters included additional cryptograms. One of these, a 340-character cipher known as the Z340, remained unsolved for 51 years. Cryptographers, mathematicians, and amateur code breakers around the world attempted to crack it. The cipher was submitted to the National Security Agency. It was analyzed by university research teams. It was posted on internet forums, where thousands of enthusiasts worked on it collaboratively. Finally, in December of 2020, a team of 3 code breakers, David Orenchak from the United States, Jarl van Eyck from Belgium, and Sam Blake from Australia, cracked the Z340 using sophisticated computer algorithms that tested millions of possible combinations. The decoded message was taunting, but, like the first cipher, did not reveal the killer's identity. The Zodiac had written that he was not afraid of execution and that his victims would serve him in the afterlife. He had also written that he hoped the authorities were enjoying the challenge of trying to catch him. Even in code, even after half a century, the Zodiac's voice was unmistakable, arrogant, theatrical, utterly without remorse. The investigation spanned decades and consumed the careers of some of the finest detectives in California law enforcement. Inspector Dave Toschi of the San Francisco Police Department became the lead investigator and spent years pursuing the case. His obsession with the Zodiac, reportedly inspiring the character of Inspector Harry Callahan in the Dirty Harry films. Toschi followed every lead, interviewed every suspect, and spent countless nights poring over the cryptograms and letters, searching for the thread that would unravel the mystery. He never found it. Over 2,500 suspects were investigated across the decades. The most scrutinized was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester from Vallejo, who was identified by several witnesses and whose behavior raised numerous red flags. But Allen's fingerprints did not match those found on the Zodiac's letters, and DNA analysis conducted after his death in 1992 was inconclusive. He was never charged. In 2021, an independent team of investigators called the Case Breakers claimed to have identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, an Air Force veteran and house painter who had died in 2018. They pointed to forensic evidence, including what they said were scars on Post's forehead that matched a police sketch of the Zodiac. But the San Francisco Police Department and the FBI declined to confirm the identification, and the case officially remains open. The Zodiac killer, whoever he was, terrorized Northern California for less than a year. 5 confirmed dead, 2 survivors, and an entire region left to wonder for more than half a century whether the man who signed his letters with a crosshair was still out there, still watching, still keeping score. The fog rolls in off the Pacific every evening, settling over San Francisco like a gray blanket, muffling sound and softening edges. In the quiet of the night, when the city sleeps and the streets are empty and the Golden Gate Bridge disappears into the mist, it is easy to imagine that the Zodiac is still out there somewhere, old now, perhaps dying, carrying with him the answers to questions that have haunted a generation. Let that image fade. Let the fog close around it. Breathe in, breathe out, and when you're ready, we'll move on. Our third story takes us south to the City of Angels in the 1940s, where a young woman with Hollywood dreams met an end so horrific that it shocked even the hardened detectives of the Los Angeles Police Department. But first, rest. Let the quiet settle. Story 3. The Girl Who Came to Hollywood. The Black Dahlia. If you've been drifting, let me welcome you back with the softest of whispers. Our third story is perhaps the most haunting of them all, not because of what we know, but because of how much we will never know. It is the story of a young woman, a city of dreams, and a murder so grotesque that it has resisted explanation for nearly 80 years. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city of contradictions. On the surface, it was the glamour capital of the world, the home of the movie studios, where stars walked red carpets and palm trees swayed against a sky that seemed permanently, impossibly blue. The war was over. The boys were coming home. The economy was booming, and Los Angeles was growing at a pace that seemed almost reckless, sprawling outward across the basin toward the mountains and the sea, swallowing orchards and ranch lands and turning them into subdivisions with names like Miracle Mile and Paradise Hills. But beneath the glamour was a darker city. The Los Angeles of the late 40s was also the city of Raymond Chandler and James Elroy, of corrupt cops and crooked politicians, of young women who arrived at Union Station with a suitcase and a dream and found, more often than not, that Hollywood had no room for them. The boarding houses of downtown Los Angeles were full of aspiring actresses who waited tables and answered casting calls and slowly, painfully, came to terms with the distance between the dream and the reality. Elizabeth Short was one of these women. Born on July the 29th, 1924, in Boston, Massachusetts, she grew up in a family that knew hardship. Her father, Cleo Short, lost his business during the Great Depression and faked his own suicide before abandoning the family. Elizabeth, Beth, as she preferred, and her 4 sisters were raised by their mother, Phoebe, in Medford, Massachusetts, in modest circumstances. Beth was, by all accounts, beautiful. She had dark hair, blue eyes, and a pale complexion that gave her an almost ethereal quality, the kind of beauty that turns heads and opens doors, but does not by itself pay the rent. She was ambitious, restless, drawn to the idea of a bigger life than Medford could offer. In her late teens, she began traveling to Florida, where she worked as a waitress and won a minor beauty contest, to California, where the sunshine and the palm trees and the distant shimmer of the Hollywood sign seemed to promise everything that Massachusetts could not. Back to the East Coast, where reality would reassert itself before the next westward pull. She moved through these places like a bird that cannot find a perch, always searching, never quite landing. She had a quality that people remembered. Men were drawn to her, and she to them. though the relationships never seemed to last. She was affectionate and warm, but also guarded, as if there were rooms inside her that she kept locked. She told stories about herself that were not always true, embellishing her background, inventing connections to wealth or status that she did not possess. These small fabrications were not malicious. They were the inventions of a young woman trying to make herself bigger than her circumstances, trying to will into existence a life that reality had not yet provided. In 1943, she moved to Vallejo, California, near San Francisco, where her father, with whom she had tentatively reconnected after years of estrangement, was working at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. The reconciliation was brief and unhappy. Beth moved to Los Angeles, then to Long Beach, where she met a young Army Air Corps pilot named Major Matt Gordon. They fell in love, or something that felt like love, and Matt proposed marriage before being shipped out to the Pacific Theater. He was killed in a plane crash in India in August of 1945, 6 days before the end of the war. Beth was devastated. She carried his photograph and spoke of him as her late fiancé for the rest of her life. After the war, Beth drifted back to Los Angeles. She was 22, strikingly attractive, and essentially homeless, moving between hotels, boarding houses, and the apartments of friends and acquaintances, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. She frequented the bars and nightclubs of Hollywood, often in the company of men who were drawn to her beauty, but whose names and faces she seemed to cycle through with the same restlessness that characterized her relationship with addresses. She had no steady income. She had no acting career to speak of, despite occasional attempts. She lived on the kindness and interest of others, and the precariousness of her existence was a fact that she seemed simultaneously aware of and unable to change. It was a life lived on the margins, beautiful and fragile and vulnerable in the way that only a young woman alone in a city of strangers can be. On the morning of January the 15th, 1947, a woman named Betty Bershinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter along South Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The neighborhood was newly developed, clean sidewalks, freshly planted lawns, vacant lots waiting for houses that had not yet been built. It was around 10 o'clock in the morning, and the January sunlight was bright and clear. Betty noticed something in one of the vacant lots and initially thought it was a department store mannequin, the kind that might have been discarded during a renovation or tossed from a delivery truck. The figure was white, almost luminous in the morning sun, lying in the grass beside the sidewalk. It was positioned with an eerie symmetry, arms and legs arranged in a way that seemed deliberate rather than random. And then she looked more closely, and the world shifted beneath her feet, and she grabbed her daughter and ran. What Betty Bersinger had found was the body of Elizabeth Short, and what had been done to her was beyond anything the Los Angeles police had ever encountered. The remains had been bisected at the waist, cleanly, surgically, with a precision that suggested medical knowledge, or at the very least, extraordinary deliberation and a sharp instrument. The cut was made at the level of the lumbar vertebrae, between the second and third lumbar, a location that a surgeon would choose because it avoids the dense bone of the lower spine. The two halves had been positioned about 12 inches apart, aligned carefully, the arms raised above the head, the legs spread in a pose that was both deliberate and degrading. The body had been completely drained of blood. Not a single drop was found at the scene or in the body itself. The face bore deep cuts extending from the corners of the mouth toward the ears, a mutilation known as a Glasgow smile or Chelsea grin, giving the face a grotesque, frozen expression that seemed to mock the beauty it had once possessed. Other injuries, too numerous and too distressing to catalog in full, spoke to a level of violence and control that defied comprehension. The body had been washed, meticulously scrubbed clean of blood and evidence before being placed in the lot. The hair had been shampooed. This suggested that the murder and the mutilation had occurred elsewhere, at a location that has never been identified, and that the killer had taken considerable time and care, hours perhaps, to prepare the body before transporting it to the dump site. The body had been positioned within view of the sidewalk, as if the killer wanted it to be found, wanted it to be seen, wanted the world to witness what he had done. There were no footprints in the soft earth around the body. There were no tire tracks. There was, in fact, almost no physical evidence at all, as if the killer had materialized out of thin air, deposited his terrible cargo, and vanished. The Los Angeles Police Department launched what was, at the time, the largest murder investigation in the city's history. More than 750 officers were assigned to the case at its peak. The dragnet spread across the city and beyond. Detectives questioned bartenders, hotel clerks, taxi drivers, anyone who might have encountered Elizabeth Short in her final days. The last person confirmed to have seen Beth alive was Robert Red Manley, a married salesman who had driven her from San Diego to Los Angeles on January the 9th, 6 days before her body was found. Manley told police he had dropped Beth off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where she said she was meeting her sister. Hotel staff confirmed seeing a young woman matching Beth's description in the lobby that evening, but she left alone around 10 o'clock, and after that, the trail went cold. 6 days. 6 days between the Biltmore Hotel and the vacant lot on South Norton Avenue. Where Elizabeth Short spent those 6 days, who she was with, and what happened to her during that time remains one of the most impenetrable mysteries in American crime. Hundreds of suspects were questioned, dozens of people confessed, a phenomenon that occurs with disturbing regularity in high-profile murder cases driven by mental illness, a desire for attention, or motivations that only the false confessors themselves can understand. At one point, the LAPD was processing more than one confession per day. Each had to be investigated and inevitably debunked. The press gave Elizabeth Short a name that would outlive her by generations, the Black Dahlia. The origin of the nickname is disputed. One version says it was bestowed by staff at a drugstore she frequented in Long Beach, inspired by the 1946 film Noir the Blue Dahlia, and by Beth's preference for black clothing and dark hair. Another version says the name was invented by a newspaper reporter looking for a catchy headline. In either case, the name stuck, and Elizabeth Short, Beth, the girl from Medford who wanted to be somebody, became the Black Dahlia, a character in a story that was part murder mystery, part Hollywood tragedy and part American myth, the investigation quickly became mired in the peculiar dysfunction that characterized the LAPD of the era. The department was riddled with corruption, internal rivalries, and a culture of secrecy that made effective collaboration difficult. Key evidence was lost or mishandled. Leads were pursued and abandoned. The press, which had descended on the case with the ferocity of vultures, published details that compromised the investigation and turned Elizabeth Short's private life into public entertainment. Letters began arriving at the Los Angeles Examiner, purportedly from the killer. One package contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, address book, and other personal belongings that had been missing from her effects. Items that had been soaked in gasoline, presumably to destroy fingerprints. The accompanying note, composed of letters cut from newspaper headlines, read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." A second note read, "Had my fun at police. Black Dahlia Avenger." Whether these communications were genuine or the work of an attention-seeking hoaxer has never been established. The letters stopped, and the case went cold. But in the decades since, the Black Dahlia case has become the most famous unsolved murder in Los Angeles history, and arguably one of the most famous in the world. It has inspired novels, most notably James Ellroy's 1987 masterpiece, The Black Dahlia, a fictionalized account that drew on Ellroy's own obsession with the case and his mother's unsolved murder. It has inspired films, television series, and an industry of amateur investigation that shows no signs of abating. The case file at the LAPD is enormous. Boxes upon boxes of reports, photographs, interview transcripts, and confessions. A paper monument to institutional failure and enduring mystery. The list of suspects put forward over the years reads like a cast of characters from a noir novel, each one plausible in some ways, inadequate in others, none ever conclusively linked to the crime. George Hoddle, a prominent Los Angeles physician, was accused by his own son, Steve Hoddle, a retired LAPD detective, in a series of best-selling books beginning in 2003. Steve Hoddle presented circumstantial evidence linking his father to the murder, including the elder Hoddle's medical expertise, which could explain the surgical precision of the bisection, his proximity to the dump site, his known interest in surrealism and sadistic art, and a grand jury investigation in 1949 that accused him of incest with his teenage daughter. George Hoddle was indeed a deeply disturbing figure, brilliant, manipulative, and capable of cruelty. He was friends with the surrealist artist Man Ray, whose photographs of bound and bisected female mannequins bore an unsettling resemblance to the positioning of Elizabeth Short's remains. But George Hoddle fled to the Philippines in 1950 and lived there until his death in 1999. No definitive forensic evidence has ever connected him to the crime. Other suspects have included Walter Bailey, a surgeon who lived near the dump site and whose estranged wife was friends with Beth's sister, Mark Hansen, a Hollywood nightclub owner with whom Beth had stayed and whose address book was among the items mailed to the Examiner, Leslie Dillon, a bellhop with an encyclopedic knowledge of the case, who drew suspicion by writing detailed letters about the murder to a psychiatrist, and even filmmaker Orson Welles, though the evidence against him is essentially non-existent. and the accusation says more about the case's capacity to attract wild theories than about any actual connection. The truth is that after nearly 80 years, we know very little more than we did on the morning of January the 15th, 1947. The physical evidence has been lost to time and institutional failure. Most of the key figures, the suspects, the witnesses, the investigators, are dead. The Black Dahlia case exists now in that strange twilight between history and mythology, a story that is told and retold not because we expect to solve it, but because the mystery itself has become the point. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had dark hair and blue eyes and a smile that could stop a room. She came to Hollywood looking for a life bigger than the one she'd been given, and instead she found the worst thing imaginable. She deserved so much more. She deserved a career and a family and a long, complicated, beautiful life. Instead, she became a symbol of Hollywood's broken promises, of violence against women, of the darkness that lies just beneath the California sunshine. Let that thought rest. Let it settle. We are more than halfway through our journey now, and the night is growing deep. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. Notice the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing, and when you're ready, we'll move on. Our fourth story leaves the distant past behind and brings us to the 21st century, to a snowy road in New Hampshire where a young woman vanished as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. But first, rest, just for a moment. Let the silence hold you. Story 4. The Girl Who Vanished on a Winter Road. Maura Murray. Welcome back, gentle listener. Our fourth story is different from the ones that came before. There is no famous nickname. There is no serial killer leaving cryptic messages. There is no gruesome crime scene for forensic experts to debate. There is, instead, something almost worse. A young woman who simply disappeared, leaving behind a wrecked car on a dark road and a silence that has never been broken. New Hampshire in February is a world of white and gray. The forests of the White Mountains are buried under feet of snow, the bare branches of birch and maple trees standing like skeletons against a sky that seems permanently overcast. The roads wind through narrow valleys and over low mountain passes, and when the sun goes down, which it does early in February, slipping below the ridgeline by 4:30 in the afternoon, the darkness is absolute. There are no streetlights on these roads. There are no passing cars. There is only the forest, the snow, and the cold, pressing in from every direction like a living thing. It is a beautiful landscape, but it is also a dangerous one. Winters in the White Mountains are long and harsh, with temperatures that drop well below zero and storms that can bury a road in hours. The people who live here are hardy, self-reliant, accustomed to isolation. The towns are small: Haverhill, Woodsville, Bath, Swiftwater, and the distances between them are measured not just in miles, but in difficulty. Getting from one place to another in winter is an act of determination. It was on one of these roads, Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, that 21-year-old Maura Murray's car was found crashed into a snowbank on the evening of Monday, February the 9th, 2004. And it was from this spot, this unremarkable curve on an unremarkable road in an unremarkable corner of New England, that she vanished. Maura Murray was born on May the 4th, 1982, in Hanson, Massachusetts, a small town about 25 miles south of Boston. She was the daughter of Fred and Lori Murray, and she grew up in a large, close-knit family with 4 siblings. By all accounts, Maura was exceptional. She was an athlete, a standout runner on her high school track team, good enough to earn a scholarship to the United States Military Academy at West Point. West Point is one of the most demanding academic institutions in the country, and Maura thrived there initially. But during her sophomore year, she was caught using a stolen credit card at a military commissary, a relatively minor theft, but one that carried serious consequences in the honor code culture of a military academy. Rather than face disciplinary proceedings, Maura transferred to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she enrolled as a nursing student. At UMass, Maura's life became more complicated. She was working multiple jobs to pay for school. She had a boyfriend, Bill Rauch, who was stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Her relationship with her father was close, but sometimes strained, and in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, a series of unsettling events occurred that have never been fully explained. On the Saturday, February the 7th, 2 days before she vanished, Maura attended a dormitory party. Sometime during that evening or the early hours of the following morning, she became visibly upset. A friend reported that Maura was crying and seemed inconsolable, though the cause of her distress was never clearly established. Her supervisor at her part-time job at a campus security office later said that Maura had called in a family emergency, but no family member has ever confirmed that such an emergency existed. On Sunday, February the 8th, Maura's father, Fred, visited her in Amherst. They spent the day together looking at used cars. Maura's vehicle, a 1996 Saturn sedan, had been involved in a minor accident a few days earlier, and she needed a replacement. Fred left that evening to drive back to Connecticut, where he was staying for work. Early on Monday morning, Maura searched online for directions to the Berkshires and to Burlington, Vermont. She also searched for rental properties in the same areas. She emailed a professor explaining that she would be absent for a week due to a death in the family. She called a condominium rental in Bartlett, New Hampshire. She packed her belongings, including textbooks, toiletries, clothing, and her computer. She withdrew money from an ATM and purchased alcohol at a liquor store, and then she drove north. And at approximately 7:27 p.m. on February the 9th, a local resident named Butch Atwood was driving his school bus home along Route 112 in Haverhill when he came upon a car that had spun off the road and into a snowbank near a sharp curve known locally as the Weathered Barn Corner. The car, a dark-colored Saturn, was facing the wrong direction, its front end pushed into the packed snow. Atwood stopped and spoke to the driver, a young woman who appeared, he later said, to be somewhat shaken but not injured. He offered to call the police and an ambulance. The woman declined both, saying she had already called AAA and that someone was coming. Atwood drove the short distance to his home, about 100 yards down the road, and called the Grafton County Sheriff's Department anyway. Haverhill Police Sergeant Cecil Smith arrived at the scene at approximately 7:46 p.m., roughly 19 minutes after Atwood's call. The Saturn was still there, its windshield cracked, its doors locked, its airbags deployed. A rag had been stuffed into the tailpipe, a detail that some have interpreted as an attempt to prevent the engine from stalling, while others have read into it more sinister implications. But Maura Murray was gone. She had vanished in the approximately 7 to 19 minutes between Butch Atwood's conversation with her and Sergeant Smith's arrival. In that narrow window of time, 7 to 19 minutes, depending on the exact chronology, on a cold February night, on a road with few houses and no sidewalks, surrounded by deep snow and dense forest, a young woman had simply ceased to be present. Think about that for a moment. 7 to 19 minutes. It is the time it takes to make a cup of coffee, to check your email, to walk to the end of a short street and back. In that sliver of time, Maura Murray disappeared from a road in rural New Hampshire, and despite 21 years of searching, not a single trace of her has ever been found. The temperature that evening was in the low 20s, well below freezing. Maura was wearing clothing appropriate for driving, but not for extended exposure to winter conditions. The snow alongside the road was deep, 2 to 3 feet in places, and the forest beyond was denser still, a tangle of birch, maple, and pine that would have been difficult to navigate even in daylight, even in summer, even for someone who knew the terrain. In the dark, in the cold, in February, it would have been nearly impenetrable. There were a handful of houses within sight of the crash site. Investigators canvassed every one of them. No one reported seeing Maura walk past. No one reported hearing cries for help. No one reported a car stopping to pick up a passenger. The road, in those minutes, was apparently empty. A corridor of darkness between Butch Atwood's house and the next sign of civilization. The search that followed was extensive. Police officers, search and rescue teams, tracking dogs, and eventually the FBI combed the area around the crash site and the surrounding wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers walked the roads and trails. The Connecticut River, which flows through the area, was checked. Nothing was found. No footprints leading into the woods. No clothing. No personal items. No body. The tracking dogs, brought in the following day, followed a scent from the crash site partway down the road and then lost it. A detail that has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some believe it suggests Maura got into a car. Others believe the scent was simply dispersed by wind and cold. The items left in Maura's car painted a partial picture. There was the alcohol she had purchased, several bottles of liquor and wine. There were her personal belongings. There was a book, Not Without Peril, a collection of stories about people who had died in the White Mountains. There was a printed email from her boyfriend, and there was a box of Francia wine that appeared to have been recently opened. Her cell phone was never found. Her ATM card was never used again. Her credit card showed no activity. She simply disappeared from the surface of the earth, leaving behind nothing but questions. The theories are as varied as they are heartbreaking, and each one carries its own particular weight of sorrow. The first and most widely held theory is that Maura walked into the woods disoriented and perhaps intoxicated from the alcohol found in her car and succumbed to the cold. Hypothermia can kill with deceptive gentleness. The body grows numb, the mind grows confused, and at a certain point, the victim may actually feel warm, may remove clothing, may lie down in the snow as if going to sleep. It is a death that can happen within hours in the conditions that existed that night, and the forests around Haverhill are vast. Thousands of acres of unbroken wilderness that extends north into the White Mountain National Forest and beyond. A body could lie undiscovered in those woods for years, decades even, hidden beneath layers of snow and leaf litter and the slow, patient work of decomposition. Animals would scatter their remains. Rain and frost would work the bones deeper into the soil. The forest floor, over time, would simply absorb what was left, the way it absorbs everything: fallen trees, dead leaves, the tracks of the animals that pass through without leaving a trace. Search teams have returned to the area multiple times over the years, using increasingly sophisticated technology: ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect remains years after death, even satellite imagery analysis. They have found nothing, but the woods are enormous, and the terrain is unforgiving, and a single person is very, very small. The second theory is that Maura was picked up by a passing motorist, either someone she knew or, more ominously, a stranger, and met with foul play. This theory gained traction over the years as investigators uncovered other cases of women who had disappeared or been murdered along the rural highways of northern New England. Claude Moulton, a convicted sex offender, lived within miles of the crash site and was briefly investigated before being cleared. Other persons of interest were examined and likewise eliminated or deemed inconclusive. No evidence has ever directly linked any individual to Maura's disappearance, but the absence of any trace of her makes the theory of foul play difficult to dismiss entirely. The third theory is that Maura deliberately disappeared, that she was running from her life, from the accumulating pressures of school, work, relationships, and the consequences of past mistakes, and that she used the car crash as a starting point for a new identity. Proponents of this theory point to her internet searches, her packed belongings, her email to her professor, and the liquor purchases as evidence of someone who was not planning to return. But creating a new identity in the age of digital surveillance is extraordinarily difficult, and there has been no confirmed sighting of Maura Murray in more than 2 decades. Her father, Fred Murray, has never stopped searching. He has devoted the second half of his life to finding his daughter, traveling to New Hampshire more times than he can count, walking the roads and trails around the crash site, knocking on doors, distributing flyers, talking to anyone who will listen. He has been critical of the initial police response, arguing that the investigation was mishandled from the start and that valuable time was lost in the critical first hours when tracking dogs might have found a scent trail, when tire tracks in the snow might have been preserved, when a passing motorist might have been identified. Fred has also fought publicly with the New Hampshire State Police and the Attorney General's office over the handling of the case, accusing them of withholding information and of failing to adequately investigate leads. His frustration is palpable and understandable. The frustration of a father who cannot protect his child, cannot find his child, cannot even understand what happened to his child. He has said that not knowing is worse than knowing, that the uncertainty is a kind of torture that never ends, that he wakes every morning with the same question and goes to sleep every night without an answer. Fred Murray is in his 80s now. The years have taken their toll, as they do, but his determination has not wavered. He still travels to New Hampshire. He still meets with investigators. He still believes that someone, somewhere, knows what happened to his daughter on that cold February night, and that someday, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps next year, perhaps decades from now, the truth will emerge from the silence. The case has also generated one of the largest and most dedicated online communities in true crime history. Message boards, podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube channels have been devoted to Maura's disappearance, with amateur investigators analyzing every detail, every timeline, every witness statement. The attention has been a double-edged sword, keeping the case in the public eye while also generating conspiracy theories, false leads, and occasional harassment of individuals connected to the case. As of today, Maura Murray remains missing. She would be 43 years old now. The road where her car was found is still there, still winding through the same dark valley, still flanked by the same silent forests. The curve where she crashed still catches drivers off guard in winter. The snowbank has melted and reformed 1,000 times since that February night, but the question remains, unchanged and unanswered. Where is Maura Murray? She was a nursing student, a runner, a daughter, a sister. She had blue eyes and brown hair, and a smile that her family describes as lighting up a room. She packed her car on a Monday afternoon and drove north into the mountains. And somewhere between the last person who saw her and the first person who came looking, she stepped out of the known world and into the unknown. Breathe slowly. Let the heaviness settle into your limbs. We have one more story tonight, our last, and it is, I promise you, unlike anything we have heard so far. Our final story takes us not to a crime scene on the ground, but to the skies above the Pacific Northwest, where a man in a business suit committed one of the most audacious crimes in American history, and then simply vanished. But first, rest. Just for a moment. Story 5. The Man Who Fell from the Sky. Divstreen D.B. Cooper. And so we arrive at our final story. If you are still awake, I am honored. If you have been drifting in and out, carried by the rhythm of the words and the warmth of your bed, that is exactly as it should be. This last story is different from the others. There is no murder. There is no victim in the traditional sense. There is, instead, an extraordinary act of daring, a disappearance that has no parallel in criminal history, and a mystery that has captivated the American imagination for more than half a century. The date was November the 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. The place was Portland, Oregon, a city that sits where the Willamette River meets the Columbia, surrounded by forests and mountains and fed by a climate that produces more rain than almost anywhere else in the continental United States. Portland in late November is gray, unrelentingly, thoroughly, magnificently gray. The sky is the color of wet concrete. The rain is not dramatic, it doesn't pour exactly, but it is constant, a fine, cold mist that hangs in the air and settles on everything, turning the city into a watercolor of muted greens and silvers. At approximately 2:50 in the afternoon, a man walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter at Portland International Airport. He was middle-aged, somewhere between his mid-40s and mid-50s, of average height and build. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, a narrow black tie, and a mother-of-pearl tie pin. He carried a briefcase and a brown paper bag. He was unremarkable in every way, the kind of man you might sit next to on a bus and forget before you reach the next stop. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington, on flight 305, a Boeing 727, for $18.52. He paid in cash. He gave the name Dan Cooper. Flight 305 departed Portland at approximately 2:55 p.m. with 36 passengers and a crew of 6. The flight to Seattle was scheduled to take about 30 minutes. A short hop up the Interstate 5 corridor over the gray-green forests and farmland of the Willamette Valley, across the Columbia River, and into SeaTac Airport. Shortly after takeoff, the man who had identified himself as Dan Cooper lit a cigarette. Smoking was still permitted on aircraft in those days, and ordered a bourbon and soda from Florence Schaffner, the young flight attendant working the rear of the cabin. When she brought him his drink, he handed her a note. Florence, accustomed to receiving notes from male passengers, phone numbers, dinner invitations, the routine advances of men on airplanes, slipped the note into her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned toward her and said quietly, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence opened the note. It read, according to her later recollection, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Florence sat down beside him. Cooper opened his briefcase, just enough for her to see what appeared to be a mass of red cylinders connected by wires and a large battery. Whether it was an actual explosive device or a convincing fake has never been determined. Florence Schaffner believed it was real. That was enough. Cooper's demands were precise and professional. He wanted $200,000 in cash, in $20 bills, used and unmarked. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes and 2 reserve chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by at SeaTac to refuel the aircraft when it landed. If his demands were met, he would release the passengers in Seattle. If they were not, he would detonate the bomb. The note was passed to the cockpit. Captain William Scott contacted Seattle-Tacoma Air Traffic Control, which relayed the information to the FBI. The Bureau began assembling the ransom money, 10,000 $20 bills, each one photographed and its serial number recorded, while Northwest Orient scrambled to locate parachutes. The plane circled over Puget Sound for approximately 2 hours while the demands were being fulfilled. The gray waters of the Sound churned below, dotted with the green shapes of islands, Bainbridge, Vashon, Maury, while the Olympic Mountains rose to the west, their peaks lost in cloud. Inside the cabin, The passengers had been told there was a mechanical problem. Most were annoyed, but not alarmed. They did not know they were hostages. During this time, Cooper was calm, polite, even pleasant. He ordered another bourbon and soda. He offered to request meals for the crew, who had not eaten. He chatted casually with Tina Mucklow, the flight attendant assigned to attend to him, about the mechanics of the Boeing 727, its range, its fuel capacity, the operation of the rear air stairs. He discussed the geography below with an ease that suggested familiarity. He complimented the crew on their professionalism. He offered to pay for his drinks. Tina declined. At one point, he handed Tina his clip-on tie and the mother-of-pearl tie pin, as if he were a guest leaving a small gift for his host. These items would later be analyzed for fingerprints and DNA, producing partial profiles that have never been matched to anyone in any database. He was not nervous. He was not erratic. He did not sweat. He did not pace. He did not make threats beyond the initial demand. He was, in the recollection of every crew member who interacted with him, the most composed and courteous hijacker imaginable, a man who seemed to regard the entire operation as a business transaction conducted with the same professionalism he might bring to a real estate closing or a job interview. Florence Schaffner later told investigators that she thought Cooper was in his mid-40s, that he appeared to be a businessman, and that she found him not unattractive. Tina Mucklow said he seemed thoughtful, even kind. Neither description fits the popular image of a hijacker, but then, nothing about Dan Cooper fits any popular image of anything. At approximately 5:39 p.m., Flight 305 landed at SeaTac Airport. Cooper instructed that the plane be parked on a remote taxiway away from the terminal. He released the 36 passengers and 2 of the flight attendants. In exchange, an airline employee delivered a canvas bag containing $200,000 and 4 parachutes. Cooper then issued his final set of instructions. He wanted the plane refueled and the remaining crew, Captain Scott, First Officer William Raditzak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow, to fly him to Mexico City. The flight plan was to take them south through the darkness and the rain, over the forests of Oregon and the mountains of California, down to the border and beyond. There was a technical complication. Cooper's specifications for the flight: rear stairway lowered, flaps at 15 degrees, landing gear down, cabin unpressurized, altitude below 10,000 feet, airspeed not exceeding 150 knots, were not compatible with a non-stop flight to Mexico City. The aircraft would need to refuel. Cooper agreed to a stop in Reno, Nevada. At approximately 7:40 p.m., the Boeing 727 took off from SeaTac and headed south. The night was black. The rain was steady. Below the aircraft, the Cascade Range stretched endlessly, a wilderness of dense forest, deep ravines, and mountain peaks that reached up toward the belly of the plane like dark fingers. At approximately 8:13 p.m., as the aircraft flew over the Lewis River area in southwestern Washington state, the crew felt a distinct change in the cabin pressure. The rear air stairs, a unique feature of the Boeing 727 that allowed passengers to board from underneath the tail, had been lowered, and then, at some point between 8:13 and 8:25 p.m., Dan Cooper strapped on one of the parachutes, grabbed the canvas bag containing $200,000 in cash, walked to the open rear stairway, and jumped. He jumped into the darkness, into the rain, into a November night over some of the most rugged, remote terrain in the Pacific Northwest, with temperatures near freezing and dropping, wind speeds that would have buffeted him like a rag doll, and nothing below him but a black ocean of forest that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Consider the physics of what he was attempting. He was jumping from an aircraft traveling at roughly 170 miles per hour at an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet. The temperature outside the aircraft was 7 degrees below zero. He was wearing a business suit, no insulated clothing, no helmet, no goggles. He had selected the older of the two main parachutes, a military surplus NB-8 that had not been inspected or repacked in years. The reserve chute he had chosen was not functional. It was a training dummy, sewn shut, unable to open. Whether Cooper knew this or simply made a mistake in the dim cabin light has never been determined. If the main chute opened, he would have descended at roughly 15 to 20 feet per second, landing in dense forest in total darkness, unable to see the ground below him or the trees rushing up to meet him. If the chute did not open, the fall would have lasted approximately 90 seconds, ending in a 200 mile per hour impact that would have left very little to find. Either way, Dan Cooper stepped off the rear stairway of Northwest Orient Flight 305 and fell into the night carrying $200,000 in a canvas bag and was never seen again. The crew, monitoring instruments in the cockpit, noted the pressure change when the rear stairs were deployed. They noted the slight oscillation in the aircraft when someone left the stairs. They noted the time, approximately 8:13 p.m. The plane continued south to Reno, where it landed safely. When the crew opened the rear door, they found the stairs deployed, the cabin empty, and 3 of the 4 parachutes still on board. The canvas bag and the money were gone, and so was Dan Cooper. The FBI launched one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. Agents descended on the area beneath the flight path, a vast, sparsely populated region of southwestern Washington state, encompassing deep forests, mountain slopes, and the drainage basins of the Lewis and Columbia rivers. Military units were deployed. Aircraft with infrared cameras flew search patterns. Ground teams, some on horseback, combed through terrain so dense and rugged that progress was measured in yards, not miles. They found nothing. No parachute, no briefcase, no body, no Dan Cooper. The case generated thousands of tips and hundreds of suspects over the years. The FBI investigated and cleared many of them. One of the most compelling was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a Vietnam War veteran and former Green Beret who hijacked a United Airlines flight in a strikingly similar fashion just 5 months after Cooper's jump. McCoy was caught, convicted, and later killed in a shootout after escaping prison. But the FBI concluded that McCoy was not Cooper, citing differences in physical description and other evidence. Another suspect, Robert Rackstraw, a decorated Vietnam veteran with a record of fraud and theft, was investigated extensively. He died in 2019 without being charged. Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient employee, was nominated by his brother, who said Kenneth had made a deathbed confession. The FBI was not convinced. The only physical evidence ever recovered from the hijacking was discovered in February of 1980, when 8-year-old Brian Ingram was playing on the sandy banks of the Columbia River about 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. He found 3 bundles of $20 bills, badly deteriorated, rubber bands still intact, totaling roughly $5,800. The serial numbers matched the ransom money. How the bills ended up there, whether they washed downstream from a crash site, were deliberately placed, or arrived by some other means, remains unknown. The FBI officially suspended its active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case in July of 2016, 45 years after the hijacking. The Bureau stated that it was redirecting resources to other priorities, but would continue to accept credible physical evidence related to the case. The case file remains open but inactive. The Cooper case occupies a unique place in American criminal lore. Unlike the other stories we have heard tonight, there is no grief at the center of it. No murdered child, no missing daughter, no butchered young woman left in a vacant lot. No one died in the hijacking. No one was physically harmed. The money was insured. Northwest Orient continued to operate. The crew went home safely, and perhaps because of this, because the crime was victimless in the most literal sense, D.B. Cooper has become something closer to a folk hero than a villain. His leap into the darkness has taken on an almost mythic quality, a symbol of the individual against the system, the ordinary man who did something extraordinary and got away with it. Bars in the Pacific Northwest hold annual D.B. Cooper festivals. Books and documentaries are produced with regularity. The case has inspired films, television episodes, and at least one Broadway musical proposal. But the romance of the story should not obscure its central mystery. What happened to Dan Cooper after he jumped? The odds of surviving such a leap at night in a rainstorm over mountainous terrain with no training on the particular type of parachute he selected were, by most expert estimates, extremely poor. Many investigators believe he died on impact or shortly after, and that his remains and the money lie somewhere in the vast forests of southwestern Washington, slowly returning to the earth. Others believe he survived. They point to Cooper's apparent familiarity with the Boeing 727, his knowledge of parachuting terminology, and his calm, methodical demeanor as evidence of someone who had planned carefully and knew what he was doing. If he survived the jump, he could have buried the money, hiked out of the wilderness, and resumed his life under his real name, whoever that was. He would be in his 90s now, if he is alive at all. We will probably never know. The forest keeps its secrets. The rain washes away the traces. And Dan Cooper, if that was ever his name, which it almost certainly was not, remains what he has always been, a silhouette against a dark sky, falling through the rain, disappearing into the night. And with that, gentle listener, our journey for tonight is complete. 5 stories, 5 mysteries, 5 questions that remain after decades, stubbornly and hauntingly unanswered. A 6-year-old beauty queen found in her own basement on the day after Christmas. A serial killer who taunted the police with codes and ciphers and was never caught. A young woman with Hollywood dreams whose death became a symbol of a city's darkest impulses. A college student who vanished from a snowy road. and was never seen again, and a man in a dark suit who jumped from an airplane and disappeared into the rain. These stories endure, not because we expect them to be solved, though we hope they will be, but because they remind us that the world is full of things we cannot explain. That certainty is a luxury, that the darkness holds more than we can see. If any of these stories resonated with you, if they stirred something or taught you something, or simply kept you company on a difficult night, I'm glad. That is all I ever hope for with this channel, to be a quiet companion in the dark hours, telling stories that matter, remembering people who deserve to be remembered. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a like, and sharing the video with someone who might appreciate it. Every subscription, every like, every comment helps this channel grow and allows me to keep telling these stories. To the victims and the missing, to JonBenét, to David and Betty Lou, to Cecilia and Paul, to Elizabeth, and to Maura, we remember you. You are not forgotten. You never will be. Thank you for being here. Close your eyes now. Feel the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow, the quiet of the night. Tomorrow is a new day. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.